Another serious question. How can our school systems excel with all these massive budget cuts and teacher layoffs and larger classes and other things that we're unaccustomed to in this state?
I don't think they can. And in my most negative moments, I have to tell you that I think some of these budget cuts, some of these restrictions, larger class sizes, teacher furloughs, are all an attempt to create a system that cannot work, so that people who don't believe in public education can say, see, it doesn't work. We have to move to a voucher program. We have to move to public support going to private institutions. I think we need to support the public institutions and give them the power and the freedom and the resources to get the job done. And that's a very basic philosophic position. I think, unfortunately, there are some Georgians who really don't understand why every Georgia child should have an opportunity to have an excellent education.
So you believe in vouchers?
No, I do not believe in vouchers.
You do not believe in vouchers?
I do not believe in vouchers. I believe that vouchers are a very last-ditch attempt. But vouchers take resources from public systems and put them in private systems. And maybe there'll be a day that we have to do that. I mean, clearly we do a little bit of that right now with universities. We do some small tuition equalization grants to kids who go to private schools. I don't think that's the way for us to go in K-12 education.
How about merit pay for teachers? We hear a lot about that.
I am a person who believes in merit pay for teachers, but you gotta have the tools in place to make it work. You've gotta have a teacher evaluation system that is agreed upon not by somebody in Atlanta, but by teachers all across the state, so that when a teacher is evaluated, they're evaluated in what they perceive to be a fair way. Clearly, test scores have to be involved, but we better do it in a way that you don't have these cheating scandals that we're talking about now. You better do it in a way that's based on student growth. It's real easy. I could find a school today that I could go teach in and teach the cream of the crop, and I'd look like a great teacher. But if I went to a school where kids are challenged both at home and at school, I might look like a failure. So we gotta get a growth model so that if that child who's struggling makes this much progress in a year, that teacher gets the credit for working with a student to enable that learning. Whereas if a kid who's bright and on their way to University of Georgia or Georgia Tech makes that much progress, that may not be enough progress to be considered adequate for that child. Merit pay is much more complicated than it looks. There has to be a fair system of evaluation. Test scores have to be used in appropriate ways. And there need to be ways for teachers who aren't adequate for the job at the moment to gain those skills. We can't just say, you're gone. We gotta be willing to do the same sort of remediation that we need to do with kids.
What about charter schools?
Well, I sort of am I'm sort of a big fan of charter schools. I believe that charter schools within the public school system give us the opportunity to have different kinds of schools. When I go to Baskin-Robbins, I don't always eat the same kind of ice cream. And when I'm sending my child to a public school, I don't want to always have that child in a school that looks just like the school next door. The district I represent has a Kipways Academy. It's a middle school. It's a school where kids go to school longer school days and longer school years. It's a school where parental involvement is absolutely insisted upon. It's a school where classrooms are given the names of colleges. based on where the teacher went to college, to always keep in the minds of the kids that college is the next step. These schools are doing remarkable things, great music programs. Those are charter schools. We have some wonderful charter schools. The other good thing about charter schools is we let them fail, and we can close them down if they don't work. And so, yeah, charter schools, they're a part of the public system. They're a part of the variety that the public system at its best can be. Sort of going back to that early demonstration school in Tallahassee, Florida, where kids had a different way of getting academic instruction. Kids don't learn alike. I mean, our two children didn't learn alike.
How do you feel about homeschooling?
I think it's a right we need to give people to have. I would never have been a good homeschool mother. I would have driven our children crazy within the first several weeks. I mean, I would have thought they ought to know it all by the time the first day was over. I think there are some people who believe that it is a good way to go about it. I think homeschoolers need to be assessed in the same sort of ways that we assess public school students. It's a little bit like if we ever get to a voucher program, that voucher school, that private school, in my book is going to have to give the same test that we give public school students so that we can see if those voucher dollars are really valuable. I feel the same way about homeschools. I think we need to have accountability because those are dollars that people have paid to government, so we need to make sure they're working. We can't just say parents like a voucher program because their kids are happier at school. We've got to make sure they're learning. That's the bottom line of school.
Several county school superintendents that I've talked with in recent times think the state should do more in early education.
There is no doubt about it. I am the grandmother of a 20-month-old Isabel. And when I see what Isabel has been able to acquire in language in those 20 months, this old reading specialist is astonished. That little girl picks up language like that because people have used language with her. They were reading her books in utero. I think we've got to make certain that all of Georgia's parents understand what happens between that day that baby is conceived and what happens between the day that baby goes to the first grade or to kindergarten has a huge impact on. There's some wonderful programs. B.J. Walker is working on a program called Reading by the Third Grade, a real effort to say, you know, kids need to be able to read to learn the end of the third grade, and that we got to start that at the very beginning. An old Casey fellow who's working with folks in 6 different systems to make sure that early learning is a huge part. The United Ways around Georgia have been very involved in early learning issues.
Well, let's turn now to other historical events during your career. You mentioned changing the flag. Oh, let me go back and ask you about Hope Scholarship.
All right.
There's some concern that the funds might disappear. Is that?
Well, we've had that concern over the years at various points, and I think this time it's not crying wolf. I think this time we're really going to have to make some hard decisions. The projections from the House Budget Office are fairly dire about can we really afford to continue to do all that we've been doing. We've passed some emergency stopgaps that may well come into play in this next year about textbooks and supply fees, etc. I think it's one of those we need to study very carefully. Hope has for us been a marvelous way to keep Georgia's brightest in Georgia. And it's one of the things that I think this next administration is going to have to work really hard to make sure that we continue to make it absolutely fair. There are folks in Atlanta who are concerned. There's a wonderful lawyer, Emmett Bondurant, who has been very involved in saying, why do we do Hope Scholarships for kids who have the economic wherewithal to go to college anyway? Should it be more needs-based? When that change was made, people were worried, will it work? But that change was very popular. And it has kept kids in Georgia. So we need to ask all sorts of questions. And of course, one of the bottom line questions is, are dollars spent on Hope scholarships for college years, might those dollars be better spent in early years? So there's always the tension between those two pots, the pre-K program that's not serving every Georgia child who could be served, and the scholarship program. Our lottery has been very successful. They've continued to raise revenue. They need to keep doing that, but we need to think about how we're going to spend those revenues. Georgia was brilliant in saying those lottery dollars can't be spent for anything other than. Brilliant.
Back to the flag. You introduced a bill early to remove the Confederate emblem from the flag.
Tyrone Brooks, a real leader in many civil rights issues in the state, had been introducing a bill. I co-signed it immediately when I became a member of the House. Georgians need to find ways to unite, not to divide, and a visible flag that was a source of division didn't make any sense to me.
And the bill passed eventually.
Eventually. Took a long time. It took real strong gubernatorial leadership to get it passed. It took strong business interest saying, you know, it's not in the best interest of Georgia economically to continue to be labeled as that state that has that symbol on its flag. It's one of those that should have been a no-brainer, but somehow it became very controversial.
Some people think that defeated Governor Barnes when he ran for a
I think that defeat
term.
was a perfect storm. I mean, you got the flag, you got the teachers who were worried. They were worried then, not like they are now, but there was worry then. It was a perfect storm. And I think there were people who were voting to say, oh, wait a minute, let's not have this be a landslide. And all of a sudden woke up the next day and it was a defeat.
What was your reaction to the outcome of that election?
I was shocked, I was dismayed, and we've spent 8 years trying diligently to keep some of the pieces of his reform in place, be it the reform that happened with property tax issues, be it the reform that happened with transportation, making Greta really a workable solution for regional transportation, making this education reform stick with what really needs to be done. It's been a hard 8 years.
You did a lot of work on gender legislation.
Well, it probably goes back to those Agnes Scott days in the sense that in my high school, not only was physics a problem, athletics were a problem. And girls deserve to play sports. Sports are a great place for learning how teams work. Sports are a great place for learning how success and failure all fits in the same arena. So I've been very involved with girls in athletics and making sure that our schools provide opportunities that are fair and appropriate.
What are some of the other issues that you have championed?
Well, my current issues, and it's always sort of where are you right now and what are you interested in? I have a couple current issues that I'm very interested in, and one of them is what happens to Georgians when they come out of prison. Georgia has a very high percentage of folks who are incarcerated. We also have, according to some of the latest data, one of the most restrictive set of policies about what people can do when they get out of prison. And so finding a place to live, finding employment, finding health care, all issues of tremendous challenge. I work closely with the Center for Working Families down in NPUV, Mechanicsville, Adair Park, great neighborhoods. And Casey has taken that cluster of neighborhoods on and is working hard. And one of the issues that's come out of there, you can't sit in a group of young men who've come out of prison and have them say to you, we've been turned down by this company for this job, by this company for this job. We've been trained to be carpenters, but we can't find a job. Ms. Ashe, what choice do we have but to go back to prison? So a huge piece of my work right now is to try to figure out how we can do a better job in Georgia, working with the Georgia Justice Project, working with the United Ways, working with Casey, working with the Morehouse School of Medicine, to bring partners together to try to work on what is a real dilemma for lots of folks. And parenthetically, cost the state lots of money, because when somebody goes back to prison, we're the people who pay.
Let's talk about water.
We gotta have it. And it's a huge conundrum. I was at the Sustainability Roundtable just last Friday talking about what happens if this court decision really holds, what happens if these three governors can't get together and solve the problem, and what power does Georgia really have in that negotiation right now when the court's ruling so far has said, Georgia, tell us about Lake Lanier, you better not withdraw for drinking purposes. So, huge decision. It's a big thing in this year's election cycle. Clearly, the bill we passed this year about water conservation was a step in the right direction. It's an incentive bill, it's not a mandate bill. I hope Georgians figure out that, that just because it rained yesterday afternoon, the drought's not really over. That just because this has been a slightly wetter year, we're always going to be able to turn the spigot. I think water and transportation are the two issues that have the potential of limiting Georgia's growth.
A lot of discussion about immigration. Georgia has an immigration law. I'm told it's not enforced. Is there a solution to the problem?
I think immigration is a federal issue. I think it's a very difficult issue for individual states to take on. I think individual states have an obligation to their citizens and to the people who find themselves here often through no fault of their own, like a child who is born in Georgia, even if their parents are not documented. I'm not going to say to that child, no education, no health care. This is a country of immigrants. For us to all of a sudden decide that immigration is all bad, I think is a huge mistake. We have business interests in Georgia that depend on people who've come from other places. There are very few of us who live in Atlanta who are real Atlantans. I'm not going to hold it against folks. I understand the frustration, I understand the shortage of resources, but somehow we got to have a federal solution that then the states figure out how to implement in the best ways for the folks who live there. I'm not going to jump up and down about immigration, except to say, please, let's be fair.
We hear a lot about breaches in ethics nowadays. Are our ethics laws weak, or do we just not pay attention to violations?
We strengthened the ethics laws this last time. Speaker of the House Richardson worked very closely with Representative Mary Margaret Oliver in doing some things that really help with some of the reporting, because one of the things that's essential is that we be transparent. And so that when somebody gets a contribution from somebody, their constituents ought to be able to figure that out, see where the money went, and know where it came from. I think we still have some things to do. I mean, I'm one of those people who believes in a gift ban. I would be perfectly delighted if people couldn't buy me a cup of coffee. I would feel better about it. I come from a circumstance that serving in the legislature is for my family an issue of civic rent. This community has been very good to our family. And so we like to think about it as the rent we pay is to share mama to the Capitol and to share mama to public policy, and almost as an expense to us. And not everybody has the opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think Americans have lost confidence in government?
I think the problems are so huge, and I think the need for immediate solutions so high that somehow they don't mesh. I also believe that we have become so divided along political parties that we have a hard time coming to consensus in the middle. Back to my League of Women Voters days, when we didn't decide on public policy until sitting around in a room we could reach consensus. Where are the common areas? We've lost that a lot in government. Now, I have a theory about why we've lost some of it. And it's gotten worse since I've been in the legislature in these 18 years. And some of it is that computer that also makes government a whole lot easier. But that computer allows folks in government to draw districts during reapportionment that are so safe for one of our parties or for the other that there are not many real contested races. If you look at the congressional races around the country right now, the races are most often conducted in the primary because this is a Republican district. And so the folks who have a shot of being elected are Republicans. So you got some very conservative Republicans and you've got some even more conservative Republicans. And you might have a moderate Republican. In a Republican primary, who's going to win? Often it's the person more on the edge. Same thing's true over here. You've got very liberal Democrats, you've got some moderate Democrats. Often in a primary, it's the extreme that wins. And so there's not much of a race in November because it's either a Democratic or a Republican seat. And so where is the discussion? In the middle. So those of us, I like to call myself a raging moderate, have a hard time figuring out how we fit because we don't fit way over here and we don't fit way over here. And when parties are dictating what happens, they're in room in the middle.
It's called the sensible center.
The sensible center. That's better than raging moderate. I will call myself the sensible center. And it's really interesting because there really isn't a sensible center caucus at the Georgia Capitol. There really isn't a sensible center caucus in Washington. And yet I suspect most Americans live in that realm of not believing this is right or this is right, but right somewhere in the middle. And I think if you don't hear your voice being expressed, you don't believe you matter. And if you don't believe you matter, why would you have confidence in the product?
What do you think about the current Tea Party?
I think it's an expression of what's going on the right. I think it's an expression of the incredible frustration that these current economic times have produced. I think it's an attempt to find simplicity in very complicated stuff. Once we had a minister, we worshiped down at Central Presbyterian Church right across from the Capitol, and we had a minister who had a great phrase. He said, there are too many people afflicted with premature certainty. And I sort of see the Tea Party as a collection of folks who have a premature certainty about the way things ought to be. Parenthetically, if I have to vote on an issue at the Capitol, if I can't argue both sides, I don't think I've done my homework. I think people in government have an obligation to know both sides of an issue before they decide where they're going to come down.
Do you think the sensible center could be a third party?
No, because we probably don't have enough in common to be able to hold ourselves together. I mean, I think the things that hold parties together are probably the things that cause parties the problems. I mean, I'd love to think so. And there are some times that some of us at the Capitol sit down and talk about, you know, how can we do this better as a team? So maybe there are little glimpses of that hope. I may leave this interview determined to find a sensible center.
Please do.
Thank you.
In addition to water, Atlanta has some severe traffic problems.
No doubt about it.
How do you solve them?
You don't solve them in one geographic area. I mean, the reality is that neither water nor transportation conveniently fit in what we call political jurisdictions. Water flows from one county to another, it flows from one city to another, transportation goes from one place to another. You know, that whole idea of how counties in Georgia were started so you could drive in a buggy to the county seat. Sometimes I think political jurisdictions get in the way, and clearly it's got to be a regional approach to transportation. Clearly the bill we just passed is a first step. Does it go far enough? No. Does it go fast enough? No. But does it say we are committed to solving transportation problems? It does.
Tell us about the bill.
Well, the bill gives different regions the opportunity to vote on a sales tax for that region, and that region will decide the projects that will be done. Now there's some overlays of a planning director from the department, but basically it is a step to say regions know what they need to do. Regions need a funding source for doing the work in transportation. It's a first step.
What if they vote not to do it? Opt out, as it's known.
We'll be in a terrible place. I mean, if a region doesn't decide they have a transportation problem. But the good news about the plan is that in urban Atlanta or urban Columbus or urban Macon or urban wherever, there's going to be the opportunity to use more rapid transit, to use more community kinds of transportation. Whereas in areas where things need to be paved, that can be what's on the list. Georgia is a very diverse state, and what we do in transportation has to acknowledge that, but it also has to acknowledge that all the parts are dependent on each other. You can't have strong cities if you don't have strong rural areas. It's got to all fit together, and we got to come around to figure out that we all depend on each other.
You're known as one who brought civility to the Georgia House of Representatives because of your work with, you mentioned Speaker Murphy and the Republicans and the Democrats. That's quite a compliment.
I certainly take it as a huge compliment and a huge challenge. We need to keep that up. We need to make sure that that is a civil place where people figure out how to talk to each other. It's a great sorority fraternity. Once you join it, you discover that the personal issues of your colleagues are very important to you, and that doesn't stop for most of us at a political line. If a family's having trouble, I don't stop and ask, is that a Republican or a Democrat? It's a person. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the basis in which we figure out how to make this happen. In some ways, I think the old day when everybody stayed at the Henry Grady Hotel was a great deal, because everybody got to know each other. And you got to know each other as somebody who played cards with you at night, somebody who went out to dinner with you. And now we so much try to get back to home, try to get back to where we represent, that I think we miss some of that coming together to have fun.
Mm-hmm. There must be something we failed to mention.
We failed to mention the Women's Caucus. And I think the Women's Caucus in the House is one of those places where folks from both political parties come together. Early on, we decided we needed a different kind of leadership. We've always had leadership that comes from both of the parties and comes from the minority community. So we have a sort of tri-leg stool of leadership. We don't agree on an agenda until both sides or all sides can come to consensus about it. Some years that means we don't have much of an agenda, but some years it means we do some very valuable things, like helping foster kids maintain some benefits while they go to college, or working on making sure that mammograms and pap smears are available for Georgia's women. So the Women's Caucus is one of those little spots of hope for me in figuring out how people can get along at the Georgia Capitol. We've missed talking about how important my family is to me and how essential they are to what it is I get to do down there. It's an effort by not only my family, but the friend community that I've built over the years. Mm-hmm. Married to the same guy for a very long time, who is my biggest cheerleader.
And a great lawyer.
And a pretty good lawyer, if I say so myself.
He is.
And very involved in things political. From his brother-in-law, who's just finished being the ambassador to Poland. And so the political genes in this family are fairly strong.
What are the major differences in the state legislature now and when you arrived there in 1991?
It's much more contentious. It's much more divided by political party. It's much more intense. Now, there was an intensity in 91, but there was also these problems aren't so big we can't solve them. The problems now seem to be so insurmountable that it's hard to figure out how to start chipping away at them. So I think there's a bigger level of frustration on the part of virtually everybody there.
Looking back over your excuse me, distinguished career, what do you think was your greatest accomplishment?
Oh, what a wonderful question. I think to this day my greatest accomplishment is the way in which I have enabled people who are in the district I've represented, whatever it was, to be involved in government, to see that their input really mattered, be it a piece of legislation that somebody suggested needed to be done, that we could get passed, be it an individual problem that somebody has had with government that I can help them get through. I think my biggest accomplishment is really being a way to empower people and to let people know that government is theirs.
Your biggest disappointment?
That we're still talking about the same things we've been talking about the whole time I've been there. We're still talking about education. We're still talking about transportation. We're still talking about water. It hadn't gotten better. It's changed in little tiny things. I mean, people just ask me how I feel about this job, and I'll tell you it's the most discouraging, disillusioning thing I've ever done. But every once in a while, something gets accomplished. Every once in a while, there's a line item in a budget that's going to really matter to people. And I know why I do the job.
Have you ever thought of running for higher office?
No.
Would you?
No. Perfectly frankly, I like sleeping in my own bed with my own husband at night. I like living in Atlanta. I like being a part of Atlanta city government. I like being a part of what I get to do doing this job. If you ask me to create a job that I'd like better, I can't think of anything I'd rather do than what I get to do.
How would you like to be remembered?
Somebody who got the job done, who worked on behalf of people, who cared about her family.
Kathy Ashe, thank you so much for being with us.
What a treat to do this. Thank you for having me.